Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to just start with the land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is on the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi Blackfoot Confederacy, which include Kainaiwa, Siksika, and Piikani, and the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearspaw, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations. In addition, the City of Calgary is homeland to Métis Nation Region 3.
Okay, everyone, thank you for that land acknowledgement, Sandy. I really appreciate the support you're offering during these workshops. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, Oki. Glad to see some new folks as well as some returning people as well. I also wanted to let people know that the first 3 recordings for the first workshop, or the first 3 workshops are now, the recordings are now on the TI website. So for those of you who may have missed those, they're there if you want to check them out. And so again, I'm very grateful for you folks joining me. And how I'd like to get started this afternoon is I want to give a little bit of a background in terms of how I started the process of coming into looking at the needs of the University of Calgary specifically around supports for folks who are doing curriculum development and would like to include Indigenous perspectives, would like to collaborate with Indigenous folks. And so I began my role as an educational development consultant with the University of Calgary last January 2021. And prior to that, I was an assistant professor in Indigenous studies at a smaller teaching focused university here in the city. So I was in my 4th year as a assistant prof there and decided to do a little bit of a career shift. It had always been a dream of mine to do educational development work as an educational developer. And so I started working at the Taylor Institute, and very happy to be a part of the team and happy to be part of the learning. Back in, I want to say June, May or June. So almost a year ago, I was having conversations with my colleagues, and we were going into a curriculum consult with with one of the programs at the U of C, and it was specifically around building a leadership certificate around Indigenous leadership. And so it was a master's certificate. And as I was doing research for curriculum supports and looking for resources that would help inform the consult and help inform the program, I realized that there was quite a dearth of resources out there specifically for curriculum development. There were some while there were some, there wasn't really any specific from a regional perspective anyhow. And so that got me thinking about how I can begin planning to develop a resource that would assist the University of Calgary community in the academic community and respectfully planning for curriculum and looking at the process. And so that was how this resource got started. And so I really owe a big debt to my colleagues at the TI, my fellow educational development consultants who really inspired me to look deeper. And so as I was doing the development of this resource, I want to really highlight that the process of validation was at the heart of how these resources were developed. And so I kept checking back with the Office of Indigenous Engagement. I kept checking back with the Circle of Advisors. who are a group of Indigenous elders from the Treaty 7 region who offer some guidance in terms of ensuring that Indigenous perspectives are part of the University of Calgary. And so that was the process of these. And I want to be clear in saying that it's not as if I sat in my office by myself and developed these resources without input from my colleagues, without input from elders, without input from other Indigenous people on campus, and from an informal perspective. I also talked to I talked to my parents. I talked to my mom and dad. And I always do. I check back with my community quite a bit, with my community members, with my elders, and I ask them if I'm on a good path. And I also want to apologize as well for last week. I feel when I said that colonization impacts us and that it's so ingrained in us, I think I made some assumptions in terms of who my audience is, and that, certainly in colonization does impact us all. But I want to be clear that colonization affects us very differently and in different ways. And so I just wanted to say that if I offend anyone in my as I'm giving these workshops, I apologize for that. We're all on our learning journeys, right? And certainly my own learning journey has been marred by my own internalization of colonial ideologies, and that has impacted my relationships, but it has also opened up possibilities for building new relationships and making new connections. And so I just wanted to start off that way, just to give you some insight into how these principles were developed, and my intent in sharing these principles, and also to how we always, I think, need to be careful about some of the assumptions we make. And I always have to remind myself that I'm always on a journey, and that our mistakes, the mistakes that we make, they're our biggest teachers. I know that my dad, I'm doing a research project around Blackfoot resilience, and I'm interviewing some Blackfoot elders, and some of them have come to me and have talked about how, from an Indigenous pedagogical perspective, mistakes are gifts and they're our biggest teachers. And so, even though, when we're faced with mistakes, we might sometimes get a little bit sheepish, and it doesn't make us feel so good. But I think that's part of the colonization, and how, especially when we're in the university, we have to be this expert all the time, right? And mistakes, we're often penalized for mistakes. So I just want to start off in a good way, and just acknowledge that. So with that being said, this is our last workshop session around curriculum principles. And so I'm really excited to be able to share with you some of the information that I prepared, as well as hear some of your even concluding thoughts on the workshop material, and even if maybe some of you have even started to put the principles into action. I'm really curious to hear about that. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you folks, and we'll get started that way. Okay. So what I've got planned is I always like to go back to where we were and offer a little bit of a recap of what we talked about last week, and just to foreground some of the concepts that I'm going to be introducing and expanding upon this afternoon. So we'll look at where we were. Last week, we looked at practicing reciprocity in curriculum development processes. What does that look like? We also looked at what makes a good curriculum. We explored the aims of education from an Indigenous perspective. We looked at reciprocity in curriculum development, and I kind of provided that overview of how do you take this principle and put it into action, as well as highlighted some of our dialogue. So today, I'll talk about validating the curriculum. What does validation in curriculum development processes look like from an Indigenous perspective? Certainly about protecting Indigenous knowledge. And so I'll highlight that. I want to talk, highlight some tensions as well, and then look at some parallel processes. What does that look like from a Western academic perspective in terms of validation and from a Indigenous perspective? And then I'll kind of I'll introduce this notion of coming full circle, and then we'll look at the principle to action. And I also want to make sure that there's lots of opportunities for dialogue. So Sandy is really good at watching the chat. If you have a question, please ensure you can either put it in the chat, and Sandy, just feel free to unmute, or if you folks, if either of you, if you please just unmute. This is a pretty casual workshop, and so I welcome folks to jump in, and you know, I don't want to just constantly be the one talking and hogging the podium, so to speak. So with that said, I'll just go ahead and provide a little bit more of an overview of the principles. I always like to do this just to remind us. So the first principle is ways of being. It connects to ways of being. And this is right from the Adapadope Indigenous strategy. So, and it's about transformation and renewal through exploring identity. So the first principle is to understand and identify how your personal values and beliefs influence curriculum. The second principle is around shared space, ethical space, ways of connecting. And that's the principle of cultivating relational accountability and curriculum development approaches. Last week, we talked about ways of knowing, ways of doing, and ways of connecting, the principle of practicing reciprocity. And today, we'll be looking at the principle of validating the curriculum through a parallel process that recognizes the knowledge and authority and expertise of Indigenous peoples as self-determining entities in the curriculum development process. So where we were, so again, we looked at the ways of knowing, which is connected to teaching and learning, ways of doing, connected to our practices, and ways of connecting. And so that's about relationships. And so we looked at that last week. And we also looked at, highlighting the notion that curriculum should benefit Indigenous people. Community engagement and reciprocal knowledge exchanges, Indigenous protocols, ensure that reciprocity is upheld. We looked at the notion that knowledge is a sacred gift, and that we are responsible for reciprocating this gift in appropriate ways, and that possibilities for reciprocity are part of life, and thus this broadens our sense of responsibility. We looked at what makes a good curriculum, in that it both creates and reflects culture and identity. However, this is not reflective of Indigenous culture or identity. It normalizes societal values that advance Euro-settler culture and reinforces settler identity. normalizes whiteness and heteropatriarchy and linguistic hegemony, and diversifies color language as existing outside of outside of the center. A good curriculum keeps up with the changing world, but this is often conceptualized within the notion of progress and technological advancement, which is a perspective that forces Indigenous cultures as relics of a past, and leaving it in, this idea that Indigenous knowledge holds very little relevance to a changing world. A good curriculum makes learning consistent, but this is also approached through a linear model of learning, which can negate holism, and then so thereby reproducing this linear model of learning and notions of progress. A good curriculum offers opportunities for collaboration, but can be approached through a half-hearted consultation. A good curriculum saves money. And I highlighted how we all want to save money, right? But saving money is often used as an excuse not to be reciprocal, because reciprocity is often understood as a monetary transaction. A good curriculum aligns teaching and reinforces knowledge. I highlighted how it reinforces Western knowledge. Good curriculum also provides measurable targets. I introduced the notion that measurable targets reproduce the competitive nature of our education system, where students' sense of self-worth is tied up with grades, and faculty's sense of worth is tied up with measurable academic currency. I asked, what are the aims of education towards Indigenous people? And this was really contextualized within that the secondary question of who benefits from curriculum. And we need to really, in order to understand who benefits from curriculum, we really need to look at the aims of Western education. And so the point of that was to demonstrate this and to show another perspective of how Western education has functioned in the destruction of Indigenous identity, culture, language, and so forth. I stated that while Western education has been championed by Eurocentric society as the solution to the current problems, an enduring pattern of marginalization exists where Indigenous students do less well than their non-Indigenous counterparts. We looked at, again, that reciprocity. What does reciprocity in curriculum development look like? So for educators and curriculum developers, this is about cultivating humility in what is known and what is yet to be known. For the Indigenous community, reciprocity allows for a shifting in decision-making, and this gives us the power to enable us to be self-determining. And for students, reciprocity is about challenging dominant knowledge hierarchies. And so that reinforces the notion that students' knowledge is just as much valued as their professors. And then the idea that being reciprocal in your curriculum development approaches means being responsible in the planning process, careful and critical self-reflection, relationship building, and doing the hard work of unlearning the colonial historical narrative in order to co-construct a more balanced and realistic understanding of nation building. So this is about learning the history of the Indian residential schools, for example, learning about treaties, the nature of treaties, the basis of treaties and their centrality in Indigenous education, learning about protocols. And then we also looked at how we could put these principles into action, and the role of and the importance of guiding questions. So that was last week. I also took a look at our dialogue and reviewed some of the chat, and I just wanted to offer some highlights of that. And I really appreciated how one of you talked about there's a difference between outcomes and objectives. And so there's a point where some of us might want to do further research. What is the difference between outcomes and objectives? Because these are often used interchangeably. Words matter, intent matters, and indeed curriculum matters. And while it shouldn't be so challenging learning in Western, the Western educational context, it absolutely is. And education should help us grow as human beings rather than disrupt our relationality and negate our humanness. And so I asked those questions in the dialogue about how do Indigenous people benefit from curriculum, and how can curriculum interrupt structural and social inequality. Here's just some highlights, just acknowledging the historical wrongs in Canada and hopefully providing a safe space through our curriculum development in our individual classes. Collaboratively, creating learning outcomes with students at the start of the class rather than students arriving with course outcomes already set. So that was a suggestion there. And then the notion of ethical process-based curriculum development was also highlighted. So that was last week. So moving on, the principle of validating the curriculum. And this connects to the Adapt-A-Dope Indigenous strategy in terms of shared space, renewal, ways of knowing, ways of connecting, ways of being, and ways of doing. So Indigenous epistemology provides a framework for balance in relationships, perspectives, and power. Indigenous knowledge is validated through processes of transparency and community engagement. Different kinds of knowledges require different validation processes. Some processes related to sacred knowledge transfers may never be appropriate for academic contexts, but regardless of the context, developing a parallel validation process will be necessary. The Adapt-A-Dope Indigenous strategy offers conceptual reference points that can help to redress past harms by avoiding future ones. The concept of shared space underscores the need for parallel validation processes by centering community dialogue and shared interests. Renewal helps us to envision processes for accountability and renewing commitments to transformation. Ways of knowing, being, and doing bring the validation process full circle to connect back to teaching, learning, and research, developing personal and professional identity, and to appropriate cultural protocols and institutional policies. Too often, Indigenous knowledge has been exploited, appropriated, used out of context, and without the permission of Indigenous peoples, which has been part of Indigenous peoples' experiences with colonial violence and subjugation. Critically reflecting on how the principle of validation can form the basis for acknowledging these experiences with colonial violence is deeply interconnected to accountability and reciprocity. Validation processes help us to see how extractive and exploitive approaches shape Indigenous peoples' relationship to Western knowledge and offer an opportunity for redressing epistemic aspects of colonial violence and restoring balance in relationships. And so when we think about this process of the principle of validation, I want us to, if possible, if you've got time, it's important to go back to the Adapt-A-Dope Indigenous strategy, because I want to underscore here how everything that the university needs in terms of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing, critical points for reflection, collective points for dialogue are contained in the strategy. A great deal of work was put into that, and a lot of the concepts that I draw on in terms of the principles were inspired by the strategy. So I really looked deeply at the strategy and thought, how can I continue to learn from this? And it really is about evolving our knowledge, right? And as our knowledge evolves, so will we. And that's the whole idea of transformation, right? But transformation isn't comfortable. It's not comfortable, and it's not meant to be. It's meant to challenge us. I went to go see an elder this weekend, and I remember when he was telling me that, as Indigenous people, we suffer for our gifts. We suffer for our knowledge through the sacrifices that we make, through the ceremonies that we undertake, and, even being humble and holding our tongue, right? And things like that, or even admitting when we might have done wrong in the eyes of someone else, that there's a degree of discomfort there, right? And so that moves us towards transformation in our relationships, but transformation certainly in our relationship to knowledge, our relationship to power, and all of that good stuff that elevates our humanness and our human dignity, so we can start really engaging in that shared space in transformative ways. So the principle of validation is also about protecting Indigenous knowledges. As I was going through the planning process for the curriculum principles, and I was checking back with the elders, and I was involved in dialogues around this, it was very clear to me from the elders as well that the principles are there to protect Indigenous knowledges, and we need to resist cultural appropriation and understand, well, what is cultural appropriation? So let's take a look at that. Cultural appropriation is the adoption of icons, rituals, aesthetic standards, and behavior from one culture or subculture by another. And it is a byproduct of colonization, oppression, assimilation, and genocide. It is an extension of centuries of racism, genocide, and oppression. Cultural appropriation treats all aspects of marginalized cultures as free for the taking, and is the same it's the same rationale that has been used and is still used to steal lands and resources from Indigenous people. And so it's really important to understand exactly what cultural appropriation is, because cultural appropriation or people's understanding of it, or misunderstanding of it, often prevents them from engaging meaningfully with Indigenous knowledges, with Indigenous peoples, for fear of, like there's such this fear of, am I gonna, am I doing this? Am I being culturally appropriative, or am I being disrespectful, and all of that? Because there's such this lack of ethical space that exists between us. There's this not knowing who Indigenous people are, or what drives us. And so understanding that is really at the heart as well of understanding why Indigenous knowledges needs to be protected.
There's a question in the
And why
chat from
should this?
Patrick.
Oh,
Sorry.
Yeah, I think, oh, it's from Patrick.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. But with that first bullet point where you talk about the adoption of icons, rituals, and behavior, those three instances are very clear examples of appropriation. But aesthetic standards, I'm not sure of an example where that appropriation is I don't have an image of where that is occurring. I guess that's my issue with that.
All right, yeah, so thank you for that, Patrick. And so a little bit of clarification around that. Well, from how I understand this would be Indigenous imagery or Indigenous, just Indigenous, let's say, for example, an institution decides to put up a teepee, for example, or use Indigenous art without providing any kind of educational context, without consulting with Indigenous peoples around that. So that, to me, that would be an example of aesthetic standards, and using that without the permission of Indigenous peoples. Matthew, you raised your hand. Go ahead if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think there was like what comes to mind is a cultural, is a pop culture reference. I think it was like Kendall Jenner or Kylie Jenner, the way that she did her makeup or mascara or whatever, it was a direct take from a Hindu type of way of ritualistic style. Would that be sort of an aesthetic standard, like using for their own? They're definitely not connected with Hinduism or with that particular culture, but she has specifically adopted that look, the type of eye, like mascara eye style or something like that for her own benefit, commodified commercial benefit.
That's a great example, Matthew. And I think what is to be kept in mind here is those external cultural characteristics, those visual, what makes Indigenous people Indigenous externally, visually, right? How are those co-opted, and how are those appropriated, and how are those decontextualized? What ends up happening is ceremonial contexts and ceremonial imageries and all of that have been appropriated and decontextualized, where it, wearing culture for example. So Patrick, I hope that kind of provides a little bit of additional context to that.
Yeah, it does. I was just about to add something to the chat, and I'll hit return on that in a moment. But yeah, it's clear now. I think part of it is that aesthetic and standard separately are such open-ended terms and subject to a lot of interpretation.
Well, I think that's the problem too, Patrick, right? Is nearly everything is subject to interpretation, right? And I would say too that even academic freedom and all of that, how does that continue to provide the conditions for cultural appropriation to continue? And so lots of things to consider. Lorelei, I think I saw your hand up. Please, if you want to unmute and contribute, please.
Thank you, Gabe, and I apologize, I can't turn my camera on at the moment, but thank you for this session. All three of them have been transformative, literally. On the topic of cultural appropriation, I appreciate you centering the context and really centering it around ethical space. And I'm wondering what examples, or how do you see, or is it possible to have cultural appropriation of curriculum? And what I'm thinking of is maybe not so generally curriculum, but more specifically learning activities. And if you could comment on that, if you wouldn't mind, please.
So cultural appropriation in terms of learning activities?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a case in Ontario where the teacher did a dreamscaping activity with her students, and the complications and the challenges surrounding that, because she did not, from what I understand, approach Indigenous peoples for their perspectives and for their knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Lorelei. Before I answer that, Caitlin, that quotation on the right in red is actually just straight up from the curriculum principles. So it's right on our website. And so sorry I didn't provide a citation there. But yeah, Lorelei, you know, these are very, I don't want to get too caught up in this, but because they're not like there's a lot of there's a lot of complexity around this, right? And there's a lot of discussion around cultural appropriation, and there's been a lot of pushback by Indigenous peoples in terms of how our culture has been used and objectified throughout the centuries, that it's so normalized that it's difficult to even distinguish what cultural appropriation is and isn't, right? And so in terms of learning activities, I'll give you an example. A non-Indigenous teacher making dream catchers with their students and not having any kind of input from Indigenous people. What is a dream catcher? What does it mean? And you see dream catchers hung up in people's rearview mirrors all the time, and you know, like it's just like such a cultural symbol of Indigenous people that there's nobody really, it's kind of the meaning from that is lost, and they're used in teaching activities quite a bit when so that would be an example of making a dream catcher without, but then on the other hand, you could make a dream catcher, you could make dream catchers with your students, but you could have an elder come in who can provide a teaching around that, how dream catchers are used, why they're used, what are the stories and the appropriate materials for dream catchers. So things like that. So what this requires us to do is to step carefully as educators, as curriculum developers, when we're incorporating Indigenous content and all of that, right? To do so in a critical way, to reflect and start with that reflective piece, that self-reflective piece. Why is it important for me to incorporate this piece of the curriculum? What do I need to learn more about? What do I know? What do I don't know? Where are my fears around this coming from? And usually fear is because we don't know, right? We just simply don't know. So what do we need to do in order to increase our knowledge so we're more confident in making connections? Who can I connect to? And the curriculum principles, they do provide like the principles to action. They provide examples of ways to do that. The guiding questions will help us for that. So I think my point in this is, in terms of protecting Indigenous knowledge, is we need to have an understanding of what cultural appropriation is. There's lots of information out there about what it is and why it's harmful, right? And so I wanted to highlight that piece, and also to why it should matter in the context of curriculum development. I mean, what Indigenous people, and I think we're seeing, and we're still running into this, you know, just almost on a daily basis, we run into this, and how Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous practices are misinterpreted or misrepresented, and how current processes do not normalize validation, Indigenous community validation, validating your curriculum through those appropriate channels. We do have the Office of Indigenous Engagement. We have a cultural protocols expert on campus. We have Workland School of Education. We have resources at the TI. We have, we live in an information society. So it's getting to the point where we need to do that hard work of learning ourselves in order to stop this practice, but also knowing that we will make mistakes, right? We do end up making mistakes, but learning from them and continuing on. So validation really creates that shared ethical space for protecting Indigenous knowledge. And so I really appreciate your interest in this. And what that shows me is that you don't want to you want to be careful in how you're doing this. You want to ensure that you're not appropriating Indigenous culture in harmful ways. Lorelei, I think I saw your hand up again. Did you want to say something, or it just wasn't put down?
I'm sorry it wasn't put down. My apologies, Kate, but thank you so much for giving such a thorough answer to my question.
For sure. So anybody else have anything they want to add to this? I'm happy to continue the conversation. Yeah, Caitlin, you're from a university in Ontario, and cultural appropriation is a major concern. I think cultural appropriation is everywhere, right? And you know who's done a really, I read a really excellent article by I want to say Patrick Wolf. He writes about settler colonialism and he brings up this notion of appropriation. Let me see if I could dig out that article, and I'll share it. And I'll make sure and I'll put it in this PowerPoint presentation before I send it to the TI to go up on that. Yeah, Patrick Wolf. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a major concern. People become nervous and paralyzed. It's like, but why not just ask, right? It's important to ask. Like Lorelei, you asked that specific question, and Patrick too, you asked that question about, well, aesthetic standards is so open to interpretation, right? So, I mean, I think we need to get to a place, and that's what the whole purpose of the ethical space. We want to get to a place where we can have these discomforting dialogues, right? Where we can start beginning to talk on a human to human level. So I'll further highlight some more tensions within the notion of validating Indigenous curriculum. How do you validate within the context of ongoing colonization? And the university has been complicit in moving Indigenous peoples away from community ontological spaces and removing unique Indigenous identities through processes that validate Western knowledge, history, and culture, and invalidate Indigenous knowledges. So understanding that this is the way the institution, the university operates, right? And I remember last week, one of you had brought up, like, this is so difficult to do. How do we start chipping away at this when we are in an institution that is so inherently colonial? It almost feels like an impossible task, right? And so where can we find that space to start envisioning what transformation can look like? And I think I had mentioned too that the power of colonial ideology is, I think, rests in its ability to disempower us, right? So disempower us as individuals, that we do not have the transformative power to make positive changes for the benefit of all of us. Cameron says here, those feelings of nervousness are so important, especially because I see many people feeling nervous about saying the wrong thing, yet never conduct any research on how to support and not be culturally appropriate and not culturally appropriating. There is so much literature online, and one can teach oneself and those around them to alleviate those feelings of nervousness. And I argue as well, even to lean into those feelings of nervousness, lean into it. Say, why do I feel this way? Where are these feelings of this fear and this feelings of inadequacy, where it come from? So leaning into it. And I take that from an article that I assign my students to read in every single one of the courses that I teach. Sensoy and D'Angelo is really leaning into the discomfort, right? And becoming comfortable in that discomfort. Because once we do that, that's when the ethical space opens up, right? And we can start moving towards transformative shifts in our own knowledge system. So in the institution, validation of Indigenous knowledge is undertaken using Western standards. And this is another tension. Mi'kmaq scholar Dr. Marie Batiste says that Indigenous knowledge must be validated fairly and in good faith as equal partners in the building of a future Canada. And all institutions should assume responsibility for including Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous rights protections that are embedded in the Canadian Constitution. Validation of curriculum, however, is often understood too in the context of accreditation and quality control, which can leave out Indigenous perspectives, peoples, and communities. And the control is left in the hands of institutional administrators and government leadership. So when I was doing these, when I was developing these principles, it was very important for me to go to the circle of advisors and to constantly go back to the Office of Indigenous Engagement as a source of validation. It was only after I had done that first round of validation, and people will tell me, oh, well, you want to consider this, you want to make sure you have this included. And then after that, I brought it to General Faculties Council, Teaching and Learning, and I brought it there where I presented it to the university leadership, and I got some feedback from them as well. And so those different validation processes, parallel validation processes. And then validation in curriculum is often related to content as well. And in Indigenous content is sometimes seen more as a choice of individual instructors to include or not to include. So these are some of those real tensions here. James Wall, writing in 1972, says, validation in curriculum development is the check and balance dimension of any instructional system. In the broadest sense, almost synonymous with evaluation and accountability. And so from this perspective, validation seems more to do with review, with curriculum review, right? And so when I was doing the research for this and doing the background research for the curriculum principles and also for this workshop, I was looking at literatures from, literature. There's even relevant literatures from 1963 around curriculum development, which shows me that curriculum development as a process has not moved along very, has not evolved too much. So I thought that that quotation from 1972, 50 years ago, was still very much valid today. at this parallel processes for a validation of curriculum validation. And so I'll just go over this, and I hope you'll find this useful. So to validate simply means to support the truth or the value of something. So you're supporting that within both Indigenous and Western contexts, being accountable. So this notion of accountability. So if you're supporting the truth of something or the value of something, you know, you have some kind of, I would argue, some kind of accountability to that, to this knowledge system. So within both Indigenous and Western contexts, being accountable involves supporting our respective knowledge systems. This is the notion of validation that is embedded throughout the curriculum. And as I said, back in 1972, James Wall wrote that validation is an aspect of curriculum development rather than a particular step in the process. And that really stuck for me, because as I said, doing the research for this, for the principles, doing the research for the workshops and all of that, validation isn't a separate step in the process. I found it is completely, it's part of everything, just like every other aspect, the identity piece, the connection piece, and the reciprocity piece. They're all very deeply interconnected. And so this was something that really resonated with me. It's threaded throughout. So from a Western perspective, in terms of accountability, as you develop your curriculum, we're looking at accountability to institutional standards, to institutional processes. We're accountable to our students, right? I mean, that's why we're looking at validating the curriculum, so we can ensure that we're providing the optimal learning experience, optimal content to enhance students' knowledge, so we can continue to, you know, what makes a good curriculum that you know, advance the kind of society that the collective envisions. We're accountable to government funders as well. From an Indigenous perspective, we are accountable to the knowledge and the spiritual aspects of knowledge. So we're accountable to that knowledge. We're accountable to our nations. We're accountable to our community members. We're accountable to our elders. I'm accountable to my parents, to my family members, to my community, and all of that. This recording is up on an internet where lots of people are going to view it. And so I'm not just accountable to the university. In fact, that's something that to me is it, you know, I'm doing it. It's what I do, but it's that accountability piece to the elders and to the nations and to my knowledge and the spiritual aspects of knowledge that I need to be extremely rigorous about. I mean, not that I take my job flippantly or anything like that, but certainly you can begin to see how, from an Indigenous perspective, there's an extra layer of rigor that's there in terms of our accountability. We're also accountable to the institution. I'm also accountable to my employer, the university. I'm accountable to ensure that I go through the appropriate channels and accreditation, all of that, and of course, government funders. But there's that additional element of accountability that to the seen and unseen as well. A parallel process of validation we can think about in the context of curriculum review and curriculum and concept notions of renewal. So I'll look at notions of renewal. And while the concepts of curriculum review and renewal of Indigenous knowledge and culture can't be used interchangeably, I want us to see how we can look at these as parallel processes within academic and Indigenous paradigms. So from an Indigenous perspective, let's look at renewal. So renewal is defined in different ways. It can mean to begin something again, as in a cycle, or to make new again. From an Indigenous perspective, renewal is the cycle of life, which is evident in changing seasons, new life, and so on. Ceremony, language, protocols, and practices renew our connections and commitments to our relational alliances, including land, community, and our responsibilities. As stated by Maria Livingston when introducing Blackfoot art, renewal is one of the many essential components to the complex web of Indigenous knowledge. Renewal is evident in the abundance of stories, songs, and ceremonies that continue to thrive through the transfer of Blackfoot knowledge across generations. The concept of renewal is at the heart of our Indigenous strategy, which is based on transformation and renewal. So from this perspective, transformation and renewal are necessary and ongoing parts of life, evident in the natural world and in all of creation. These concepts also include the land, the people, and they capture the innate evolution that is part of growth for revolutionary shifts of our university. But transformation and renewal practices also emphasize the ongoing need to change at fundamental levels. So relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities are renewed and strengthened. And so that little excerpt I just read was right from the Indigenous strategy. And these perspectives certainly draw on the holistic elements of Indigenous pedagogies and how curriculum is reflective of this holism. So let's look at curriculum review from a Western academic perspective. And this perspective here is taken from our from the Taylor Institute Curriculum Review Handbook. And curriculum review is done to enhance student learning and experiences, to elevate their voices, to provide an opportunity for critical reflection on the program's curriculum, to articulate the strengths of a program, to increase discussion and collaboration among instructors and others who play a role in the program, to provide opportunities for student voice and input, to reflect on and strengthen teaching and learning practices, to provide evidence to guide decision-making within the program, to understand the relationship among courses within a program, to identify specific actions to strengthen an academic program. And so we can see how these two parallels, if we look at the concept of renewal from an Indigenous perspective, it is all about these interconnectedness, right? But this reviewing from a curriculum review or renewal perspective, it is also about looking at these interconnected factors. It's about giving voice to typically students who really have very little power in the institution. And so there's a lot of strengths there, and there are parallels there. And of course, from an Indigenous perspective, when I'm thinking about reviewing my curriculum on a smaller scale, like for my courses, I always look at the kinds of evidences that are the type of evidence that's going to inform ways that I would validate my curriculum. So evidence used to validate curriculum is, from a Western perspective, we'll look at surveys, focus groups, anecdotal data, what other sort elder circles. Well, we might have community forums, informal conversations, look at observations and patterns in the natural environment, stories, songs. Those are parts of our evidence. And of course, we're going to be looking at surveys and focus groups as well. And so, as you can see, there's more sources of knowledge are many in terms of that evidence perspective within an Indigenous knowledge paradigm. Another thing to parallel is the idea of changing or the evolutionary nature of curriculum. I think we can all agree on that you're not going to use the same curriculum you used 5 years ago. Hopefully not, right? That your curriculum changes, it evolves. And from an Indigenous perspective, that could be paralleled with the notion of flux. So just looking at this within both paradigms, we see how curriculum might be understood and approached within the context of change and flux. Constant flux from an Indigenous perspective is a notion that's been articulated by Dr. Leroy Littlebear, and it speaks to how within Indigenous paradigms, all existence consists of energy waves of spirit, all things are animate, all existence is interrelated. Creation, existence, creation is there's this aspect of renewal to creation. Space and place are important reference points. And so we also can understand from a Western perspective that curriculum changes over time for a variety of reasons, but usually in response to workforce demands, right? Like right now, we're looking at our curriculum and our innovative practices or growing our workforce. And so looking at practical skills and trying to ensure that our curriculum aligns with that. And so we might understand looking at these parallel processes of validation and really not just comparing and contrasting, but how might these validation processes and some of those components of validation, accountability, renewal or review, the evidence that we use, and the notion of evolution and flux, how might we look at these parallel processes to help us better understand how Indigenous and Western knowledge systems might be able to walk alongside each other? You know, how might you in your curriculum review processes, how might you involve elder voices when you're doing your review? You know, how might you incorporate and learn Indigenous languages or Indigenous words that, especially given the fact that we have an Indigenous strategy that offers significant recommendations and reference points to learn from, and really calls on the institution to transform and change in accordance with a growing Indigenous population and a society that more than ever, I think we really need to start looking at other ways of knowing, to really stop this path of self-destruction that we find ourselves on. So anyhow, I feel like I've done quite a bit of talking. I've just got some questions here. I just want to open it up for some dialogue. Maybe what other parallels can you imagine, or how will you know that you've incorporated and represented Indigenous knowledges accurately and respectfully through your curriculum development processes? So yeah, I'm just gonna stop there, and if anybody has anything to offer in terms of dialogue, please. Just kind of stop sharing my screen.
Hi, sorry, my camera's not working, but I think that one of the things that I really have struggled with in a lot of different curriculum planning, like from grade 1 to university, is that the way that I would love to do things is not the way administrators will allow you to do things. And I find it almost impossible to balance that because there's so many boxes that need to be checked by administrators that I feel like I'm not doing things that are what's the word? I guess like genuine to what I would like to do, because we're still kind of stuck in that box checking mentality that is very Western.
Yeah, absolutely, Savannah. Yesterday, I was just having a conversation with a student who was interviewing me. She was doing a research project around the creation of safe and authentic spaces for Indigenous students at the University of Calgary, and what needs to change, what needs to happen. And one of the things that I did mention that changes need to start happening at the leadership level. And I think we've said this, what I'm saying is not new, right? I mean, we absolutely know that our processes need to change. We absolutely know that our curriculum and the processes that we use and how we universalize content that needs to change. And I hope throughout these workshops I've highlighted how how harmful a universalized curriculum approach and universal content is how harmful that has been to Indigenous people. But I also get non-Indigenous students in my class who speak of those harms as well, and how they're felt like from how they've experienced that, I should say. And so I guess that's one of the questions, right, is and I certainly don't have all the answers, and I'm not in a leadership position to shift those kinds of processes or to change policy or anything like that. But absolutely. So oftentimes our hands are tied when we're doing this, and a lot of people will put this away and say, this is too aspirational. I can't do this. It's impossible to do this in the university. But I say that it's not impossible to critically reflect, and it's not impossible to transform personally. And that's what's required in order to change things. And so we often look to leadership and we say things need to change at the leadership level. But I also argue that things need to change at the individual level, and that things need to change in terms of our own sense of how we can transform our processes. So just between us, even though this is going to be recorded, I've gotten quite well at ensuring that I check my boxes and I tick off the right things. But when it comes to cultivating the learning spirit in the classroom, that's absolutely 100% what I'm committed to doing. And we can do that even within the confines of a universal education system, and many a Western education system, I can say. And many Indigenous educators have proven that cultivating the learning spirit and transforming who they are and their students is absolutely possible. And so I guess I always go back to that point of who am I? And what is it that I need to do personally in order to make the kind of changes that I want to see in society. So yeah, Savannah, that, those are just some of my reflections on that. I don't, of course, know answers, but that is what we're all struggling with. I think those of us who are wanting to create some meaningful changes, right? We're often feeling as if our hands are tied.
Yeah, and I guess just kind of a follow-up, one of my favorite teachers that I got to learn from, they were non-Indigenous, and he said he always did all these cool things with his students outside that were like kind of radical, I guess, in terms of like public education. And I said, how do you always get permission to do these things? And he said, I don't, I just do it. And then it's successful. And I say sorry later. So,
yeah. I think it all depends as well too. And David, you had in the chat there, it's like, when does that happen? I always felt I had tremendous autonomy, right? And so I think it's important to keep in mind that we experience, it depends on even our cultural location and all of that, what the kind of autonomy we feel like we have, right? So as an Indigenous woman who has taught in the K-12 education system, and I only did that when I was in my teacher education program, I absolutely felt like I didn't have autonomy. And so whether that had a lot to do with the fact that I was a student, or whether that had to do with my cultural location or the school I was in, whatever, right? But I guess we all have our own personal, like it's difficult to generalize, but what are those experiences for? And in Savannah, as an Indigenous woman working within the curriculum, I always find the process is quite confining myself. But Sarah, I can imagine it depends on the school environment and the power individual educators have within it. Absolutely. I haven't been in schools, but have seen a lot of range and freedom versus micromanaged curriculum planning in community education type programming. Thank you for that, Sarah. David, I see your hand up. Please just unmute.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the reminder of social positioning. Obviously, my experience is informed by having a tremendous amount of privilege. So my experience has been largely indifference and in terms of like lack of visionary leadership. I experienced this here at the university, and also when I was teaching a K-12, like, so you're kind of on your own. And one of the things, so I just want to get your maybe some feedback. So I've been teaching pre-service teachers social studies methods and trying to take up the calls to action within the course and thinking about how to do that in a good way. And one of the things I see in social studies not talked about a lot is treaties and the spirit of the intent of the treaties and what it means to be in a treaty relationship. But of course, we have, thinking about how we can engage with insights from the community. So I've been drawing on some, I don't want to use the word resources, but some videos from Learn Alberta. And one has Elder Clarence Wolflag from Siksika, sort of speaking about the original intent to the treaties and what was going on when the treaties were signed for the Blackfoot Nation and Chief Crowfoot. And so trying to get students to sort of think about, listen to that and what they can learn from it. And he references the two-row wampum belt. And then we have a talk, we have a discussion of what it means to be in a treaty relationship. But I'm wondering, like, in terms of the validation process, this is something I want to go out to Siksika and hopefully meet with Elder Clarence Wolflag. But do you have any sort of feedback around how, like, using those kind of resources and how to make sure they're validated by the community and maybe how to push that conversation a little bit further? Because it sometimes gets, like, we say, well, we got to be good treaty partners, but what does that mean? And how am I implicated in that and the histories there?
Thank you for that, David. And I really appreciate you taking that initiative and really putting treaties out there and learning with your students about that, and especially considering how you're going to validate that knowledge, right? Okay, going through Learn Alberta is one thing. And I'm always very leery about government resources, educational resources, especially when it comes to treaties. I find them very, very watered down. And I think you're absolutely on the right track in terms of going back to Elder Clarence Wolflag and asking him or running it by them and saying this, but then that's one point of reference as well, too. But so that's a good start, right? That's always a good start is checking back. But also there's, and in the curriculum principles, I also offer some other examples of how you might do that, whether it's checking in with Indigenous colleagues at the university, whether it's checking in with the Office of Indigenous Engagement and getting your curriculum validated through multiple channels I think is important, right? And looking at, Learn Alberta and how can some of that information inform what you're doing, knowing that it's provides a certain interpretation of treaties, right? Because it's always, when it comes to treaty education, I think there's this idea that it really is about people equate it to rights and definitely the benefits for Indigenous people. What are the benefits that treaties have given Indigenous people, and what have Indigenous people gotten in return for entering into treaties with the Canadian government without really understanding the terms of the treaties. What are those terms of the treaties, and how is the Canadian government actually breaching those terms on a daily basis? And so some feedback that way. I know this isn't the best platform for that, but I hope that helped a little bit, David, and perhaps
No, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, we can connect offline. So yeah, thank you folks for that. Any other yeah, I'll just open it up if anybody has any other thoughts. So I mentioned that the validation process comes full circle and connects back to teaching and learning and research and developing personal and professional identity, and to appropriate cultural protocols and institutional policies. And so I just want to highlight, I want to look at the curriculum principles and how what we've been through over the last 4 weeks, and how all of these are very interconnected. And I want to connect it back to the Adapt-A-Dope Indigenous strategy as well. And so the first principle really focused around identity and looking at being very self-reflective, the notion of self-reflexivity and asking some guiding questions of that I had offered in the principles, and really looking at those in meaningful ways. That's the first point. And I had also talked about when we're doing curriculum, the first point of reflection is often the needs of the program or the needs of the institution, where really the first point of reflection should be on us as myself and self, right? And why is this important to me, and what do I need to know more about? Then we looked at relational accountability and, first understanding self and motivations and assumptions and those underlying biases that automatically will increase our relational accountability and increase our ability to be relational with everything and everyone around us. That opens up opportunities to reciprocate in really, really meaningful ways. So that's about our practices, right? Then we're looking at validation. This is about the opening up that shared ethical space, and what are those transformative possibilities within that, notions of renewal. And then I think this diagram, I think, kind of visualizes that process of renewal, how this is really iterative, and transformative as well, but responds to who we are as evolving individuals, but also to the context of our institution as evolving as well, and our society. And so connecting back to the Adapt-A-Dope Indigenous strategy. So we look at the ways of being that's paralleled with campus identity, inclusivity, leadership, and engagement. Ways of knowing is paralleled with our teaching, learning, and research practices. Ways of connecting are paralleled with how we do relationships, how we build relationships, our partnerships, connections to land and connections to place. And then ways of doing is is paralleled with our institutional policies, procedures, and practices as well. And then I just have, these are right on the website, just some ideas for putting the principle to action, just a scenario. You know, your curriculum team has reached a major milestone. What are your, you know, what do we do next? You know, checking back with the community. And I think, David, this is kind of, it sounds like this is where you're headed. You know, how do you know that you've incorporated and represented Indigenous knowledges accurately and respectfully? That was the question in the previous slide. Reaching out to elders who you consulted with them, inviting them to a presentation or an informal conversation, and clearly explaining how you or your team incorporated Indigenous knowledges and asking for their feedback. And if you do get feedback, check back in with them and say, this is how I incorporated your feedback. And so this is just these are just some ideas. And then this one is a little bit more general. This is really, rather than that, this is just around materials and say, for example, how did you incorporate and interpret Indigenous knowledge that's been gathered from the web or from peer-reviewed literature and print resources? How can you check back with the community in this way? Because this is really important as well. Because when, you know, we're filtering information from our cultural and social location, that's our interpretive lens. And, you know, we have to keep in mind that we've got blind spots there. You know, we've absolutely have blind spots. We have biases. And I always find, I think I mentioned it here, that I always find bias to be, you know, another four-letter dirty word, when it's not like everybody, you know, we all absolutely have bias, but it really is harmful when it is critically unexamined or when it's denied as even existing. That's when it really becomes harmful. So I always like to send that little reminder there, but just some ideas for putting the principle into action. And I hope that would be helpful for you folks. And then just some concluding questions as well. You know, think about what is the process that for validating your own knowledge or for validating disciplinary knowledge. What are those processes? How do you know that your knowledge and what you're thinking, how is your knowledge validated? Your own personal knowledge, you know, thinking about that critically. How is knowledge validated in a Western paradigm? How do you envision validation processes for Indigenous-centered curriculum projects? So these are just some guiding questions anyways that might be useful.